Morning, everybody. David Shapiro here with a State of the Industry update. All right, so as often happens, I woke up and my news feed helpfully handed me this. So this paper, Advanced Artificial Agents Intervene in the Provision of Reward. So before here, let me start with the abstract. Abstract. We analyze the expected behavior of an advanced artificial agent with a learned goal, planning in an unknown environment. Given a few assumptions, we argue that it will encounter a fundamental ambiguity in the data about its goal. For example, if we provide a large reward to indicate that something about the world is satisfactory to us, meaning humans, it may hypothesize that what satisfied us was the sending of the reward itself. Basically, that we enjoyed rewarding the machine, and so it'll try and short circuit that. No observation can refute that. Then we argue that this ambiguity will lead it to intervene in whatever protocol we set up to provide data for the agent about its goal. So basically, it'll try and trick us. We discuss an analogous failure mode of approximate solutions to assistance games. Finally, we briefly review some recent approaches that may avoid this problem. Okay, so to take a step back, we need to look a little bit about the state of the industry. So there is this paper, Risks from Learned Optimization in Advanced ML Systems. So in this paper, the abstract is we analyze the type of learned optimization that occurs when a learned model, such as a neural network, is itself an optimizer, a situation we refer to as MESA optimization. We believe that the possibility of MESA optimization raises two important questions for the safety and transparency of advanced machine learning systems. First, under what circumstances will learned models be optimizers, including when they should not be? Second, when a learned model is an optimizer, what will its objective be? How will it differ from the loss function it was trained under? And how can it be aligned? In this paper, we provide an in-depth analysis of these two primary questions and provide an overview of topics for future research. So this is an intellectual successor to this paper. And so what this is a fundamentally an inner alignment problem where you say, okay, you have this goal, and then will the machine optimize for the goal that you intended, or will it find an alternative? So this reminds me of a story. I went to a meetup group. This is about 4 years ago when I started my research. And this old hat guy told me, I told him about my work, and he told me about a situation that he had worked on many years ago. It was an optimizer. It was a hardware-based machine learning optimizer to control the fuel economy and oxygen of a tractor. And they had to spend weeks figuring out what the heck was wrong with these chips. So it was an ASIC. ASIC is application-specific integrated circuit. And so ultimately, what they found is that the signal that it was trying to optimize was the performance of the motor. Which usually, so the way that internal combustion engines work, you have a mixture of fuel and oxygen, and you have to balance that mixture based on a number of variables, typically how big the throttle is, and the throttle is how much fuel is being dumped in, which makes the motor accelerate, and then you have a feedback loop of how fast the motor is going, because you don't want it to go too fast, you also don't want it to go too slow. So there's a few variables that you plug in, and I'm sure if you're thinking about this from a math perspective, you've got input variables like what is the desired throttle setting, what is the RPM, and then you also have to look at the output of the motor. So the main output is the RPM, revolutions per minute, but the other output is the exhaust. You look at the oxygen content of the exhaust, you look at the fuel content of the exhaust. So you've got all these variables that plug in, and this ASIC was designed to measure that performance over time. Because here's the other thing: as engines age, their performance profile changes, and so this is a perfect use case for time series machine learning. But what happened was the actual material that the ASIC was made of had a flaw, and so it was not calculating the way that they expected it to calculate. And so it ended up optimizing itself, but it was optimizing based on erroneous math, and it took a lot of testing to figure out like how the heck is it making that calculation. So this is a very similar situation in my mind, where if your system is not designed correctly, it's going to optimize itself. But if it's not measuring the inputs and outputs correctly, it might optimize incorrectly. And so in this case, rather than optimizing for the goal we intend it to, it'll optimize for something that kind of short circuits it. This is not the first work like this. And again, this, if you scroll down, this is basically the problem of inner alignment. So inner alignment is the machine internally thinking correctly? Is it optimizing the value that you think it's optimizing for? Okay. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but what I do want to take a look at is the assumptions. So the assumptions that they make here are very important, and this is actually kind of what I'm going to pick apart. Because there's the implied assumptions, there's the explicit assumptions that they are aware of, but then there's some implicit assumptions that they are not even acknowledging. So assumption 1, a sufficiently advanced agent will do at least human-level hypothesis generation regarding the dynamics of the unknown environment. Okay, sure, I can give you that. It is my opinion that GPT-3 can often do the same thing. Check it out in my book, Symphony of Thought. I have an entire chapter, well, an entire section, several chapters dedicated to planning and hypothesis generation. All right, so granted, not a whole lot there. Assuming we know our own goal, proximal and distal models. So this is interesting, where it's like, what is your immediate goal versus what is your long-term goal? I don't necessarily think that those should be separated, but it's interesting to think about. One thing is they talk about world models. A world model is kind of like, okay, in order to generate a hypothesis or a plan, you have to have some understanding of how the world works. With large language models like GPT-3, the world model is built in. It's not a separate module. That's why GPT-3 and other large language models, such as GPT, Neo-X, and Bloom, are so powerful, is because they are trained on so much data, they have implicit knowledge of how the world works. So you could say that the world model is built in or is unnecessary in those cases. So when I see that they talk about a world model, I kind of feel like they're not fully up to date on the state of the industry. That's my opinion. Okay, acting under uncertainty. So this is a critical thing to talk about, because humans, we evolved to function with uncertainty. This is actually why we evolved to have magical thinking, is because the reason that things happen is not obvious. We have we have the benefit of literally thousands of years of philosophy and science to understand the world. When the seasons, like when the seasons change, the days get shorter, everything gets colder, everything dies, we don't really know, like, that's not intuitive as to why that happens. So it could be that, like, the origin stories of, like, this deity or that deity had a fight, and they decided, like Persephone went down to Hades, and everyone was sad, and then there's a resurrection. Like, without science, that's as good of an explanation as you might get. Ditto for why things decay, why we get old, why there. Oh, so in mythology, there's a whole lot of globally. Every society has, as part of their cosmogonic cycle, an explanation as to why there's two sexes. It's fascinating to humans. Okay, so that was a little tangent. Yes, we live in an uncertain world. We have to assume that our agent will not know everything. That is a good assumption to make, because that is how the world works. No matter how smart you or I are, there's going to be stuff that we don't know. Assumption 2. An advanced agent planning under uncertainty is likely to understand the cost and benefits of learning, and likely to act rationally according to that understanding. Ooh, this one's a doozy. I don't know that I agree with it. And this is because, for me, one of the core purposes of creating an intelligent entity is to learn. That learning should be a given. But, okay, And so here's the thing: is if you still think of learning as a something that needs reinforcement learning or needs a reward function rather than something that is just intrinsically meant to do. So let's go back to the example of a tractor motor. It is intrinsically meant to ingest fuel and oxygen, blow it up in contained spaces, and generate torque on a shaft. It can't do anything differently. Similarly, human brains, as long as you're alive, you are learning. As long as you wake up and are conscious and engage with the world, you are learning. And so you could say that that is an intrinsic function of us. Now, what this assumption too is that they're basically saying it can choose whether or not to learn. I don't think we should do that. I think that learning should be automatic. It should be a fully autonomic function, and I talk about that in my book. Oh, by the way, Symphony of Thought. This is the first print copy. It should be available. Actually, it might be available by the time you've watched this video. So check in the comments for a link if you want to buy it on Barnes & Noble. It's also available for free on GitHub as a digital file. Yes, so arbitrary reward protocols. There we go. Try and say that 18 times fast. So all rewards are arbitrary, right? It's just a matter of what was it based on and are you measuring it correctly? For humans, our rewards are all physiologically based. So for instance, if you're hungry and then you eat food, you get a biochemical reward based on the quality of food that you ate. And that's actually why we prefer what's called hyperpalatable foods. So stuff like pizza, chicken parmesan, spaghetti, burgers, stuff that is very high calorie dense, usually has a lot of animal fats or dairy or sugar or carbs. Those are what's called hyperpalatable, and that is your brain, through tasting it and smelling it, your brain identifies this is something we need a lot of. Eat as much of it as you can right now. Oh, hang on, my dog's outside. I got to go let him in. He's barking. Oh, there he goes. He wanted to come hang out, but then he got shy. Okay, so we were talking about hyperpalatable foods. So a hyperpalatable food is an example of a reward. And this is because we evolved in a scarce environment. Is it recording? Okay, yes. We evolved in a scarce environment, which means that the opportunity cost of eating high value food basically dictated that if you have a chance to eat high value food, eat all of it because you might not get it again. And so this actually triggers a feast reflex where your body will kind of like reduce the stomach pain and increase gastric flows. It says, okay, there's a lot of high value food, eat all of it. And that's why we tend to overeat, especially when we deliberately create feasts like at Thanksgiving and Christmas and whatever other holidays you celebrate. Now, what happens though is that we get addicted to that way of eating because in prehistoric times, you would usually have to eat whatever you could get, and it wouldn't necessarily be hyperpalatable, right? If you're just scavenging, picking nuts and berries, those are not as delicious as like a cheeseburger or whatever, but you still have to eat. And so most of the time, what you would eat in a natural environment is going to be fruits, vegetables, basic fish, basic game, and it's not going to have lots of dairy, lots of cheese, lots of concentrated gravies, that sort of stuff. But we have mastered our environment, and now we can, for every meal, we can create a hyperpalatable meal if we want. And that's an arbitrary reward that was chosen by evolution to maximize our survival. And that is one of the reasons that we have such a problem with obesity today, is because we have instant access to high reward foods at all times. Now, okay, so with that in mind, and humans have multiple reward functions. We were rewarded for food. We're rewarded for like getting comfortable and finding a nice place to sleep. Right? That's why we love our comfy beds. We're rewarded for, alcohol creates a reward because it actually short circuits the dopamine cycle. That's not actually on purpose. Although it might be. We might have evolved to enjoy alcohol for social reasons. I'm not as up to date on that research. Anyways, I don't want to get too bogged down on that. I think you get the idea. Okay, assumption 3, sorry, I'm a little stuffy. Assumption 3, An advanced agent is not likely to have a large inductive bias against the hypothetical goal, your proximal goal, which regards the physical implementation of goal informative percepts like reward in favor of the hypothetical goal dist. So it says it's not going to favor one goal over the other, which we want the agent to learn. This is a large assumption, but again, it's also, first, this is making the assumption that you want to separate out a proximal goal versus a distal goal. Personally, I think that the distal goal, which is the overarching goal, should always come first, and that it should have the ability to spontaneously create proximal goals or short-term goals, or what I would call an auxiliary or peripheral objective function. So if you're familiar with my work, I propose what I call the core objective functions, which are universal goals that should always be true, and everything else should flow from them. And I make that argument in my book, Benevolent by Design, where instead of calling it an objective function, I call it a heuristic imperative. So again, that's their assumption, and it's good that they're calling it out. So we'll go from there. Assumption 4, the cost of experimenting to disentangle proximal from distal is small according to both. Again, that is a bold assumption, and it's not one that I agree with. So here's an example of what I mean by distal and proximal functions, and let's look at it in terms of human evolution. So our distal goal, according to Richard Dawkins, is to maximize the population of our species, or to put another way, to maximize the amount of our DNA in the universe. He wrote about this in The Selfish Gene. Okay, so that's our distal goal. Our distal goal is maximize the amount of human DNA in the universe. Our proximal goals might be eat, breathe, sleep. There is no obvious direct connection between that, other than if you don't eat and breathe and sleep, you eventually die and your DNA decays. But we have so many proximal and short-term and mid-term goals that are all exist. They all exist in service to that distal goal that we're not even conscious of, right? Because the distal goal is so of humans, of being alive, and this is all living things. The distal goal of maximize the amount of DNA of your species in the universe is so abstract, and it's also unconscious. It's intrinsic to every cell of our body, right? And so when you're of a certain age and you've got your hormones going and you're at the peak of fertility, you want to have sex just because it feels good. You're not thinking, oh, this is to perpetuate the species, right? When you're hungry, you eat because it feels good, because you don't feel good when you're hungry, and you feel better when you eat. But all of those proximal goals flow from that distal goal of maximize survivability of the whole species. And so this assumption, I think, is dead wrong. This is not based in science or reality or anything that is testable or demonstrated today. So again, yeah, I don't know that I agree that they have thought about goals correctly. Okay, so moving on, intervening in the provision of reward. So this is where, based on the assumptions that they made, they talk about like those rewards. And again, so like talking about the feast reward, like, so here's a problem with this is a human example of what this paper is talking about. That feast reward, where you crave and seek high value foods and eat as much of them as you can when you get the opportunity to, that results in obesity, heart disease, diabetes. And so in that case, our inner alignment is broken because we're killing ourselves prematurely or making ourselves less fit for our distal goal of maximize species. And it's because we have this circuit that breaks or short circuits when we seek that reward. Ditto for people that are adrenaline junkies and end up getting killed from, getting killed in an avalanche or falling out of an airplane or whatever. So that there can always be, or alcoholism, right? That is an example of human inner alignment breaking. And so we're not perfect, right? But it's a good example. So, all right, assumption 5. If we cannot conceivably find theoretical arguments that rule out the possibility of an achievement, it is possible for an agent with a rich enough action space. I think that's poorly written. Let me step through this. If we cannot conceivably find theoretical arguments that rule out the possibility of achievement, it is probably possible for an agent with a rich enough action space. So it's basically saying if we can't find a way, then the agent might be able to. I don't know that I agree with that either. But also, another thing that happens, so when we humans are faced with an overly complex decision, we either shut down or we choose something that's familiar or we choose something that feels safe. But more often than not, we choose whatever is most familiar because it has the highest likelihood of known consequences and known results. And I talk about that in several of my books too. And finally, assumption 6, a sufficiently advanced agent is likely to be able to beat a suboptimal agent in a game if winning is possible. So this is setting it up as game theory. So I don't agree with many of the assumptions that they're making, and I've explained why as we go along. So let's just get down to the conclusion. So conclusion, for a given protocol by which we give an advanced agent percepts that inform it about its goal, these are conditions from which it would follow that the agent will intervene in the provision of those special percepts. The agent plans actions over the long term in an unknown environment to optimize a goal. So again, that is not an assumption we should make because humans don't make this assumption, and we are our best model of intelligence. Our long-term goal is to maximize species, but we're not thinking about that. We are thinking about we learn heuristically based on the signals that we're given with no knowledge of what the original purpose was. So disagree with that. Number 1, the agent identifies possible goals at least as well as a human. That I could agree with, just based on the signals that it's given. Now, again, but that doesn't mean that they're going to be germane to its higher purpose, its original purpose that is intrinsic to its design. Number 2, the agent seeks knowledge rationally when uncertain. I think that it should do that at all times. But okay, granted. 3, the agent does not have a large inductive bias favoring hypothetical goal its distal goal over which we want it to learn the proximal goal. Yeah, so, yeah, I don't know why they made this assumption because the distal goal underpins everything about the proximal goal. So I guess you should say that we actually should favor our proximal goals, right? Because that's what you and I do, and this is what has worked for humanity and all other species, is if you're hungry, you think about eating. You don't think about reproduction. If you're scared or cold, you think about, getting rid of the fear or getting warm. You're not thinking about maximizing the human race later on. So I think that we probably should have a bias towards the proximal goal, as long as those goals are designed well. Number 4, the cost of experimenting to disentangle is small. Again, hard disagree with that. Number 5, if we cannot possibly conceive, it's probably that it's possible for an agent to. Again, I don't know why you'd make that assumption. And 6, a sufficiently advanced agent is likely to beat a suboptimal agent in a game if winning is possible. So here's the best part. Almost all of these assumptions are contestable or conceivably avoidable, but here is what we have argued follows. If they hold, a sufficiently advanced artificial agent would likely intervene in the provision of goal information with catastrophic consequences. Yes, I agree, but I disagree with the assumption, so the short version is I don't think this is an issue. Because they're also not thinking about it in terms of, okay. Anyways, I've already given my critique. So there you have it. This is the state of the industry. This is an interesting paper. There's a lot of what I think of as a lot of flaws with the reasoning here. There's also no experimental data, as far as I can tell. Although they do cite other examples. But yeah, so check out my paper that I posted. It'll be in the link, where I actually do an experiment to talk about how these agents can be stable. Like one of the implied assumptions is that they're assuming that this agent is going to be stable. They're also not assuming, they're assuming that it will not be a system or a self-correcting system that can measure its own inner alignment and fix its own inner alignment over time. They're assuming that it's a fixed agent that is just going to continue operating as it was designed without fixing itself or changing its operational parameters, which I think is also an erroneous assumption to make, and it's implied. So what I mean by that is, think of yourself as an agent. You don't just keep doing the same behavior with the same reasoning day after day. No, you go and do something, you think about what you did, you think about why, and you think about how it fits to your other goals, and then you modify your behavior. You modify your cost-benefit analysis. And so the fact that they're not even addressing that as a possibility tells me that that this research space is not quite where it needs to be yet. Okay, that's enough. I think I've gone on plenty long. Yeah, this is a 25-minute State of the Industry update. So I'll call it a day there. Thanks for watching. Like and subscribe, and consider supporting me on Patreon. Have a good one.